Today, I'm here because I want to talk with you all about what is referred to as the school-to-prison pipeline. And that's a kind of a popular term that you might have heard of. Are any of you familiar with that term, the school-to-prison pipeline? Who's heard of that? Okay, so some of you. Well, if you haven't, no worries. I'll fill you in so you know what I'm talking about. And even if you haven't heard that term, you might have seen it when you were in high school or in younger, hopefully not, but you never know, because it is a pervasive problem that we have here in the United States. And so what we're going to talk about first is an explanation of what the school-to-prison pipeline is so that you all understand it. And then we'll go ahead and talk about the causes of the school-to-prison pipeline, who is affected, particularly, as Professor Rebay said, kids of color and kids with disabilities. And if you're a kid of color and a kid with a disability, you really are adversely affected by this phenomenon called the school-to-prison pipeline. And then we'll also talk about how kids are affected, what it means, and then strategies to stop the school-to-prison pipeline, which is really what I'm all about, because I want to stop the school-to-prison pipeline. But before we go on to talk about it, we do have, the nice thing is that we have a pretty good chunk of time, and people who know me know that I can kind of get in the weeds sometimes and talk a lot about detailed stuff, so hopefully I won't go off do that too much, but at least give you enough information. But if you have questions along the way, I can try to answer them. If I find like I'm running out of time, then maybe I'll sort of readjust and then we'll save the questions to the end. But I also don't want to start talking about something and then lose you guys and not be able to explain something. Also, because I am a lawyer, sometimes I start getting into that legal talk and it might get like annoying, and so I want to make sure that you understand. So please just, feel free, and I'll take the questions as we can, and we'll just readjust if we need to, if that sounds okay with Professor Rubin. So that's what we're going to talk about, and that's the plan for today. So the first thing is, okay, what is the school-to-prison pipeline? And if you Google it, you can Google school-to-prison pipeline, and you will find all kinds of things. A lot of stuff from the ACLU. They do a tremendous amount of work. But what it is it's pushing kids out, elementary school kids and secondary school kids, out of the public school system into the juvenile justice, and for the older kids, sometimes the criminal justice system, out of school. And it's through various disciplinary interventions that take place in public schools, and also to a certain degree in some private schools, but really the focus is really particularly in the public school system. And also sometimes it's called push out, so if you type in push out in Google, you will also find that as well, references related to the school-to-prison pipeline. But that's really what it is, that's what we're talking about. So, and this is a systemic problem. This is a problem that happens all throughout the United States. There are pockets of innovative places, and I can talk about where, towards the end, where some innovations, including here in Los Angeles, have happened to try to stop the school-to-prison pipeline. But this is a pervasive problem, and I'll explain to you why in just a moment. And this pushing out of kids, it has a particularly disproportionate effect on kids of color, kids who are low income, who come from low-income families, and kids who have disabilities, particularly mental health disabilities, and sometimes intellectual disabilities or co-occurring disabilities. And as I said before, kids of color who also have disabilities have these disciplinary interventions have a particularly negative impact on these kids. And so I really want to explore with you why that is, and just what that looks like. It's pretty shocking, actually. So first of all, let's talk about how did this all start. So there's a couple of things. It's not that I'm going to talk about. It's certainly not the exclusive list. There's not like one point in time when I can point to you and say, aha, that was when the school-to-prison pipeline began. I can't do that. But this problem really wasn't something so much when I was a kid. And I'm kind of old, that's true, but it really wasn't something that was really an issue so much. There were other issues, but this issue really wasn't happening And that's because there were some key things that occurred. One of them was the enactment of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. So it was enacted in 2001 and became effective in 2002. And have any of you heard about the No Child Left Behind Act? Okay, so some of you have heard of it, and I bet that just looking around the room, just guessing that probably many of you, if you graduated high school in the last 10 years, then you've been, this has had some impact on you. And what the law requires, just really simply, and in a nutshell, is that it was enacted because to make states that are receiving federal funds for education, and that's every single state, because they all want money, and that's a reasonable thing to want because the school systems are underfunded and they need money. So they get money from the federal government. But in order to get money from the federal government, they have to comply with certain requirements. That's the deal. And I won't get into all the constitutional stuff that I might get into with the law school class, so you're off the hook on that. But the funding is tied to getting higher test scores. So part of the No Child Left Behind Act requires that schools produce higher test scores, that they lower dropout rates, all kinds of things like that. And so those seem like good goals, right? Keep kids in school. That seems like a really good goal. The problem is that the way in which it was implemented has been very controversial, and a lot of people don't think that the policy is effective and really is doing what was originally intended. So some of the problems have been that there's all these requirements that school districts have to follow, get the test scores. Even teachers, their performance is rated on how well their students do. So everything is about teaching to the test and making sure that these kids get high test scores. That's, when I was a kid in school, that wasn't the focus. But I know from working with lots of kids, I've worked with kids here in LA, I've worked with kids up in Massachusetts, particularly in Springfield, Massachusetts, and it's all about teaching to the test. So a lot of the subjects that I could enjoy when I was in high school, and they don't have those anymore, or they don't have nearly the breadth. And the focus is, you got to pass the test, you got to pass the test, and so everything is a race because the test is coming and the kids have to get ready. So that's been a problem. There's also been a problem that in order to do that, the resources that are needed in order for the school districts and the schools to meet the requirements that they have to meet, they need a certain amount of resource. But the funding that the federal government has given hasn't been sufficient. So that's been another problem. So even though they're getting some funding, it's not enough for the districts and for the schools to keep up their end of the bargain. So that's been another problem. The other problem is that when kids don't meet the requirements, the resources are short, they're not getting what they need, and they're not scoring, and they've got some sort of behavioral problems, maybe due to a disability, this makes the districts, I don't think they sit around and say, consciously, we want these kids out, or maybe they do, I don't know, but hopefully not. But the reality is that when kids aren't scoring on those test scores the way they need to, that's bringing the district down. The district might not get the money. The state might not get the money. So there's all this pressure. And so then for kids that are having problems and are struggling, then this law gets in the way. Because rather than do the things that this law was intended to do, which was to keep kids in school and bring up the standards of education so that the education that you get here in Los Angeles and the kids who are maybe in a less affluent area, perhaps in like Mississippi, will get the same opportunities for education. Unfortunately, it's not working like that. So that's one of the reasons that the school to prison pipeline has developed. But it's not the only reason. Coupled with the No Child Left Behind Act. So is everybody clear on what happened with the child? Okay. But coupled with this was something called zero tolerance policies. So are any of you familiar with these? Okay, so some of you have heard. And I guess I'm also going to say that if you've graduated high school in the last, well, I guess now I should say 15 years, 10, 15 years, these zero tolerance policies have been around a while, and you may have seen your classmates have to deal with them, or you might have had to deal with them. But what they are these policies that really say that school districts have established, often they establish codes of conduct or some sort of rules, and they are what they sound, no tolerance. It kind of is like the airlines a little bit, you know. You can't, they won't put up with anything. Well, it's just like this, except in schools, but worse. And so for any violation of the rules, then all of a sudden there's these draconian disciplinary measures that are imposed, and much more than when I was in school. So what ends up happening is, the idea was to, behind these zero tolerance policies, was to reduce violence in schools. And a lot of it really began after the Columbine shootings in Colorado, and people fearful of things like that, and that often happens. One thing you should know, especially when you're thinking about policy, and especially in any sort of disability, mental disability policies, is that when things like that happen, then the public reacts. Politicians use it to their advantage, and that's an opportunity to really clamp down and impose very restrictive types of policies. And that we see that all the time, like with the insanity defense and other kinds of things. I won't get into that because that's not the topic for today, but it's not surprising that after Columbine there was a response. Similarly, after what happened in Connecticut, and those events are horrible events. I'm not saying that they're not horrible events, but the problem is that the responses are not necessarily the responses that are helpful. And so here we had these zero tolerance policies that were established, and really to try to deter the violence in schools and drugs and crimes, and have safe schools. And that's not a bad thing. Going to school should be safe. Absolutely, it should be safe. But the problem is, the way in which it got implemented was that it was overboard, because then there was no more discretion. And so you may sometimes hear on TV or in the news, read in the newspaper, some little kid brings a bottle of aspirin to school, and the next thing you know, they're arrested because they had drugs at school. They had aspirin, and that's against the rules. And so now they're arrested for that. So that's the kind of thing that happens with these zero tolerance policies. And so as a result of the zero tolerance policies, we have seen a huge increase in in-school and out-of-school suspensions, because any sort of violation and you're out. Expulsions have increased. Many school-based arrests for what would be school-based behaviors or schoolhouse behaviors that are typical of children, and dropping out. And to give you a flavor of like what I mean about school-based arrests, I'm not just talking about, there are certainly kids who might come to school with guns or weapons or drugs, and be violating our existing criminal codes and all of that. That happens. And that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about are things that in the past, like I'm sorry to keep going back to when I was younger, but that's my reference point, you would never be arrested for. So I have clients right now. I had one client who, with a mental health disability, who was running and screaming in the hallway, arrested. You know what for? Disturbing lawful assembly, or disturbing school assembly. I know of a young girl who was arrested for throwing orange juice. There are countless things like this. You can be arrested for throwing a pencil, or even throwing a paper airplane, because that might be considered an assault. And certainly it's disturbing school assembly, throwing a paper airplane. So it sounds ridiculous, but it happens all the time. And I more like back to me and my own reference, but and I have my father here, who's come from Stanford University. Today, the other Professor Dorfman, the original Professor Dorfman, Jerry Dorfman, there he is. And he probably, I don't know if he'll remember this, but I think I'm really lucky that I wasn't in school back then, or during this period of time, because I might have been arrested. And, that's just sort of like this librarian type. But you know what? When I might have been arrested in school, when I was in 5th grade, I was angry because they changed the swing policy at my school. You could no longer stand on the swings, and you couldn't, we used to do this sort of double swing thing where you kind of like a spider. It was kind of cool. We really loved it. And then one day, we could do this for years, and then one day, erroneously, in my mind, the school administration said, you can't stand on the swings anymore. Forget it. I'm sure that probably somebody fell off and got hurt and they got sued, or I don't know. But anyways, I was furious about this. And so I decided that we were going to have a protest. And I led a protest and marched around. And this was in Ames, Iowa, by the way. And I marched around singing this little song that they taught us in our music class, because back then we had music class, and it was some song called Freedom Isn't Free or something, because I was in 5th grade and we were studying the American history. And I marched around, and I had the little girls behind me and soon the little boys, and we were all just marching around singing this. And this was the day that I was supposed to be in the Rip Van Winkle play. And I was very excited. People were coming. It was very exciting. And they were furious because this was the 10:30 recess. I was marching around, and it was very annoying. So they hauled me off. The other kids got to go back to class, but I was hauled off. This is like 1 of 2 times in my life, to the principal's office. And where, the principal was like out, and so they made me sit there and wait for him to come back. But they said, you're probably not going to get to be in the play. And you know what? Your other punishment is, we're going to call your parents. And I thought to myself, oh, be my guest. I invite you to call my father. I'm not getting punished for this one. This one, I think I know that I'm not in trouble. All I did was march around and protest. But nobody was there. There were no cops there to arrest me. Nobody said, oh, Dorfman is disturbing lawful assembly. Get her in the cop car and book her. She's 10, she's really a problem, get her out. Nobody said that. So the big threat was, you're not going to be in the play, and we're going to call your dad. Not so much of a threat. And you know what? I was in the play, and my dad didn't give a damn. So, that's just my own personal example. But today, if I pulled that same little maneuver, absolutely would be arrested. Now, I probably have a good defense, but that's another story. But the point is that I'm not kidding you when I'm talking about these things happening. They happen all the time, constantly. Kids are being pushed out of school. And I'm going to go over some data with you to really demonstrate what the problem is here. But these are the kinds of things. And so again, I'm not talking about big deal stuff. So the other thing that has happened, and also you may have experienced this when you were in school, but as a result of zero tolerance policies and these increased school-based arrests are the increase of having police in schools. Well, I can say that this is something that is all over the United States. Police are in schools in different kinds of ways. So I'm from Massachusetts, and so I work with do a lot of education, policy, and legal work in Massachusetts. And so, it depends on what school district you go. In some school districts, they have, they have police, but they're not in uniform. They're often referred to as resource officers in the schools, but they're there. They can make arrests, but they're not in uniform. They don't have weapons. Other school districts, they are in full uniform, and they are carrying guns, and they're in the schools. And unfortunately, after the events that took place in Connecticut, and you know what I'm talking about, the little children that were shot by Adam Lanza in Connecticut, in Newtown. Sandy Hook, Sandy Hook. No, is it Sandy Hook? No, it's I thought it was Newtown. I drive by it all the time, but anyways, I live up there, I should know. But anyways, I think Sandy Hook was the school, wasn't it? Or, yeah. Yeah, so, you're right, and Newtown is the town. Yeah, so there, we're all right. Unfortunately, I know that that the U.S. government and state governments have really tried to come up with responses, and unfortunately, one of the responses is to put more resource officers and more police in schools. And The problem with that is that when you have police in schools, while I understand the motivation, they want to protect the little kids from outsiders coming in, but the problem is that when you have police in school, you're going to have a much higher likelihood of school-based arrests, because there they are. And so what ends up happening is you have increased arrests. You have school staff who might have, if the police weren't there, they might have dealt with an issue without calling the police. Maybe you got a kid like me marching around, chanting some sort of protest. Well, you can deal with that in the context of school. But when you have the police there, then the reaction is, oh, you know what, I'm just going to call the police to come, and they're going to deal with this kid, get this kid out of my classroom, because it's taking time away from me teaching to the test, because I got to get these test scores, and this kid is in my face, and I got to get the kid out of here. So that's what happens. And so when we have increased arrests, we then have the whole school to prison pipeline thing happens, because you see, the kids are being arrested, so then they're pushed out into the criminal justice system, and then all of a sudden, every single time there's an arrest, you trigger a whole process. So unless you get arrested and everything gets dropped, which doesn't usually happen, unfortunately, then this whole court process starts, and then the kid has to take time out of school and go down to court and appear before a juvenile court judge. And then that whole process, then there usually have to be appointed a lawyer, depending on what ends up happening if the case isn't dismissed right away. And then there's a whole process. Kid, might have to do community service, might have to, sometimes gets sent to juvenile justice into custody. It just depends on the kid. And the more times it happens, then the longer the punishment is, the more likely that the child is going to be sent to the juvenile hall. For kids who get released on probation, then they're told, condition of your probation or the condition of your bail is going to be that you have to go to school and you got to follow the rules. You better behave. Well, then what happens? So they go to school and they're kids. They throw an orange juice. They, run in the hallways. They scream. They throw paper airplanes. And then what ends up happening? Arrested again. Or the school says, that's it. You threw that paper airplane. You're not supposed to. I'm calling your probation officer. So then the probation officer comes and takes the kid and, either they get more punishments added on to what they already have, or maybe they're then taken into custody, depending on, the state and the situation. And I'll come back to, I saw both of you have questions, I'll come back in just a second. But this just keeps happening and happening. In the meantime, parents are being called and they're being told, come and get your kid. Your kid is doing this and that. We're having your kid arrested. Go pick him up at the place where the kid is booked. Or if you don't come and get your kid, we're going to arrest him. So then parents have to leave their jobs and then go get their kids. They often can't afford childcare or don't have childcare. They're supposed to be at their jobs, but they can't be. So what happens? They lose their jobs countless times. I have so many parents telling me, I can't keep a job because I have to keep going down to the school to pick up my kid because my kid's going to be arrested otherwise. And I'm in terror that my child's going to be arrested. So I'll stop that for a moment because I know that there's a couple questions, and I apologize for making you guys wait. I think you earlier had a question in the purple.
Oh, no, it was not a question, it was like a comment.
Oh, go ahead.
Zero tolerance policy. Just to kind of like the extremity of what it was, I remember in my high school experience, we had like drug dog sweeps, where we had a couple times a month, the policemen would come with dogs, and they go into a classroom, get the kids out, and then like sniff through all their things and make arrests then and there. I thought that was a very interesting process that was happening at school, and it just reminded me of the presentation.
Yeah, and that is part of the whole zero tolerance policy. You're exactly right. And while they legally can do searches, you don't have the same protections that you would have like in your house and that sort of thing. Still, you're trying to go to school, You know, school shouldn't be like you're in a juvenile hall, but that's what sometimes it feels like, I think. I think you...
Hi, so question, yeah, so when you're getting all these school punishments, this is going on your permanent school record, so that when you're going, maybe even applying to colleges, you're presenting that to a college that you want to get into, and, you know, if you don't have 4.0 GPAs, like for a lot of people in this room, then, you know, you get demerits, so even getting into colleges, even if they're able to get into a college, it makes it an impossibility, right? It goes on their permanent record, right?
Right, and I mean, now juvenile justice records are sealed. So,
They are sealed.
So
Oh.
when you're arrested as a juvenile, but you bring up a good point, because there are other things that a college could get to. And so I think your point is a very important point to talk about for a second, because, well, more than a second, but, you know, just right in the moment. But while juvenile justice records are in fact sealed, so if I did something, had I been arrested when I was 10, unless I told you that, you know, you aren't going to get to know that. There are a few exceptions to certain things, but not that kind of thing. But the problem is that what often will happen is that if you get arrested, you may also get, so not only have you been arrested, but the school might punish you as well. So you might also get suspended. And so your suspensions are part of your records. So, you know, that's going to be as part of your permanent records. And the reasons that you got suspended are going to be there. There's going to be incident reports, all kinds of things. And education records, they are confidential. But if you're trying to, you know, get yourself into college, or, you know, what about a job where there's a background check, and so you have to consent to release information, they're going to get that information. So that, you're absolutely right. That's a very important point to make. Was there another question? Okay, so the other thing that I want to mention as part of this that relates to the whole school to prison pipeline thing is not only that the arrests occur, and, you know, the suspensions and the expulsions, but there's also a tremendous amount of use of force that happens. That really, it terrifies me. I have clients who are injured all the time. Just while I was here this past weekend, one of the kids that we're working with was injured. Because when you have arrests, police use force, and oftentimes the police are using the force that they would use, you know, to catch somebody who was running down the street, and they wanted to apprehend them. So kids, you know, are being injured as a result of the use of force. They also are subjected a lot to seclusion and restraints. So this is another problem that's related to this, which is that when kids are doing things that the school feels are behavioral problems and out of control, then they often will put them in restraints. And there isn't, each state has their own laws about what you can or cannot do. But, and so that makes it difficult. There's not like one federal law that says these are when you can restrain people and this is when you can't. But I can say that the restraints are used much more freely and in ways that would never be allowed even in a psychiatric hospital. So, for example, kids can be restrained, what we call prone restraint, face down. Very dangerous. Very dangerous. It's dangerous for an adult to be restrained face down. You could stop breathing. But they're restraining kids that way. And while there's different, like I said, different restrictions, depends on the state that you're in, those things are happening and kids are getting hurt. And it's not just the police that are doing it, it's the teachers. Some are trained, some are not. Some are using the restraints according to what the law allows, and some are not. And so that's all part of this school to prison pipeline, and then is enhanced by the presence of police in schools. So as you have guessed, I'm not a fan of having police in schools. So I talked about already the increased and unnecessary reliance on police when they're there, and the increase in just arrests for minor stuff that you just, you know, would never even think about calling the police. So that gives you a picture, I think, of what is, you know, why the school to prison pipeline has evolved and what it looks like, what it means. Before we move into seeing what does it look like and who it affects, because we're here to talk about its disproportionate effect on kids with disabilities and kids of color, and that's why the data is so important to talk about that, to help us discuss that. But does anybody have any questions at this point about what we've talked about so far? No? Yeah, go ahead.
Who really advocates for this strict of a policy and like for young children? Because I feel like on both sides of the aisle, like growing up, all the parents really felt that matters were too extreme as far as what schools did in responding to it. So what political groups are really making this remain as the status quo as opposed to something different?
Well, I would say that, I don't know of a particular political group, although they end up having coalitions in state legislatures, but I think what happens is, and I don't want to be unfair to teachers because they aren't given the resources that they need, but I think that, in some cases teachers, but a lot of teachers are pretty horrified by all of this and don't want this. They didn't get their teaching degree to have kids arrested. That's not why they're teaching. But they aren't, the classes are too big. They're not getting the supports that they need, the training that they need. And so they're, at a loss of what to do. School administrators, because of limited finances and the pressures of the No Child Left Behind Act and that sort of thing, they often are the ones, like if you are at the state legislature and you're trying to get changes, they're often the ones, not always, but they're often the ones that are saying, no, we have to have this because we don't have any other way. And I think, this kind of gets into the remedies, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but that's where the part of the remedy has to be replacing all of this stuff with something that actually works and something that's going to be effective, that will give comfort to everybody that the schools are safe, but at the same time, let children just go to school and be kids and not have to be worried about being arrested all the time. So, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but that's really, I think, really at the heart of it. And sometimes there are bad actors. Most people are not bad actors in this. This is a system thing for the most part. But occasionally you get bad actors who have done bad things and have bad motivations. But by and large, it's about money, it's about system changes, and that kind of thing.
Well, and those police resources have to be incredibly expensive. So you're saying that money could be reallocated in a more constructive way.
Absolutely. And every time, remember how I said that when a kid gets arrested, it triggers a whole process. Well, it triggers the whole juvenile justice or criminal justice process. So think about how expensive that is, because every time, if you have to then take the kid, book them in, there's all these police resources, and do the police really want to spend their time with the kid that threw the pencil at the other kid or at the teacher? Really? I don't think so. It's expensive and time consuming, and really what does it achieve? And then you have not just the police money, but then you have money with the whole court system. Attorneys, while public defenders and prosecutors don't get rich doing this kind of job, they still have to be paid. There's still a process. Judges have to be paid. It's expensive. And then there has to be probation, or if they're taken into custody, who's paying for the juvenile halls? Well, all of that is tax money. That's where that money is coming from, because that isn't No Child Left Behind money that's going to pay for that. So you're absolutely right. It's a very expensive matter, and if there was a shift in thinking, you could really reallocate those resources, and you can make safe schools. And there have been some really great examples. Indianapolis has been able to really turn some stuff around and really do some innovative things. Here in LA, they're doing some innovative things. So that it can be done. It's a change in thinking and reallocating money and just moving away from all of the stuff. It would be nice if the No Child Left Behind Act was either changed or, I don't know, something else happened so that people weren't so obsessed about test scores and all of that, and that there could be some more flexibility. So I think there's a number of changes, and we'll come back to talk about some things that are happening. I can give you some more details about some efforts that are being made in just a bit, but you're right. So now let's move in to talk about data. And so data is really, you might think, oh, boring, because I sometimes think that, because I'm not a math person or a numbers person at all. I'm much more interested in words and other kinds of stuff. But the fact is, data really matters. And if you all are planning to do disability rights work, which I hope you are, whether it's policy work or you're going to go to law school and be a disability rights attorney or whatever it is, or a doctor or whatever, data really, really matters. And why does data matter so much? It's because data does a couple of things. It tells us, we can hear all these anecdotal stories about horrible things that are happening, or even about individual kids or even groups of kids. Like, you shared about having the dogs coming and sniffing at the lockers and doing all of that stuff. So we can hear those stories, and those are very important, and they help inform and people who want to make policy change, whether it's legislators or other policy advocates or attorneys, judges, doctors, other professionals. But that's not enough. And, I can just speak from being a perspective of being a lawyer. If I'm in court, if I have one client and I represent an individual, then, the information about the one person, that's going to be very helpful. And that's going to matter absolutely. And if I have the evidence, then I might, and the right claims, and it all matches up, I might be able to win my claim that way, win my client's case. But I like to make system change. So I'm bringing cases on behalf of groups of children, hundreds of children at a time. And so in order to do that, because right now I have a case against Springfield, Massachusetts, and their school district. And I want to have it certified as a class. And so I won't be speaking too specifically about that case. I'll give you some information that I can, but just generally, if I want to help a group of kids and get a class certified, do you know what a class is? A class action? Okay, so that's like a lawsuit on behalf of a group of people. So in order to do that, you have to meet certain requirements. So you need more than just one kid story. You need to be able to show that this is a systemic problem and be able to show that there's different requirements. I won't get into the requirements of what is needed for class action, but you have to show that systemically this is a problem. And so data helps us look at that. But it's not just for lawyers, because if you want to go to the legislature and you want to make a change, so going back to your point, if you want to, parents want to get some things changed, kids want to go get some things changed, and you want to go see your legislator, well, it will be really helpful if you have some really good data. It's great to have personal stories, and that's an absolute key component, and it's true for the lawsuits as well. But you got to have the data when because that really shows what a problem it can be. And I'm going to give you some examples that probably, well, I don't know if they'll surprise you. They surprise me, although not really. But the data really is important. The other thing that data does that's really important is that not only does it help us identify the scope of a problem and what is a problem, because when you have data, you have what we call metrics. So those are things by which you measure. So they're things you're measuring to get data. So how many kids are being arrested? How many kids with disabilities are being suspended each year? How many kids who are African American and have a mental health disability are being suspended each year? Those are metrics. And so by measuring that with data, then we can really zero in and figure out what the problem is and how extensive the problem is. At the same time, it helps inform us what the remedy should be. Because if the data isn't showing, and it's not exclusive because the data might be wrong, and we'll talk about that a little more in a minute, but the data can also help us figure out where our resources are best put strategically, whether, again, it's through a policy intervention or a legal intervention. Where should we start? where should we really invest our resources, because we all have limited resources, and what makes sense to grow from there. So that helps. Once we get a remedy, then we have to measure, is it being implemented? And that's, when I sue somebody and I get a settlement or a court order, that's not the end of it. That's just the beginning of it, really. I don't go away. And some of my cases have lasted for 10 years, much, to the annoyance of the defendants. But I have to hang around because I have to make sure that what I got either through a court order or what I got through a settlement is actually happening, and happening properly. And so that's when you need data, because that's how you measure. So data is super, super important. And and that kind of helps when sometimes if you're not a numbers person like me and you kind of go, numbers. But then when you think about its social importance, then you realize, okay, it's not so bad. Some of the federal statutes that exist where states get federal money in order to provide education have certain data reporting requirements, because the government, they too want to make sure they're getting their money's worth, and they want to make sure that there's compliance. Just like I want to know in a settlement of my lawsuits, or if my court order, that I won is being implemented, I want to know what the data says. Well, they want to know, and they use the data in similar ways. So one example I put up here is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, which is also known as the IDEA. It's the federal special education law, and you might have heard of it. There is a state in California. There's a state one also. It's similar. States can always add more rights. They can't take any rights away that the federal government gives, so they can give more. In Massachusetts, we have, for example, a state special education law that gives more rights than the federal law does. So, for example, under federal law, kids who are 16 and over who are in special education have a right to transition planning to help them plan for when they leave school and go into the community as adults when they're 16. That's what the federal law says. In Massachusetts, it's 14, so you get started earlier. Do the school districts comply? Not so much. And so you're always having to bang their heads and try to get them to do it. It's a resource issue. But that's just an example of the special education law. So I don't mean to divert, but going back to the topic of data, which is really what we're talking about right now, the IDEA, the federal special education law, does require, as part of the condition of giving federal funding for special education services and related services to states that in turn give it to school districts and schools, they have to report data. So one of the very important requirements is that they have to report, and this isn't the only data, but this is one piece of data that's particularly relevant to the issue of the school-to-prison pipeline, is that they have to report data of the incidence and duration of disciplinary actions by race, ethnicity, limited English proficiency, gender, and disability category of children with disabilities who've been suspended for 1 day or more. And this is really important because this helps us figure out what's going on. And this is how we know that there's this disproportionate effect of all these policies that we've been talking about and practices on kids with disabilities and kids of color who have disabilities. Now, there are other reporting requirements, but I wanted to just focus on this one as an example. Does anyone have any questions about this before we move on to the more data discussion? Okay. So, now, the bad news. So we have this great requirement, all this data is required, and data is so important, but what happens? Guess what? There's non-compliance with data reporting, and it's a big, huge problem. And here at UCLA, there is a wonderful center called the Center for Civil Rights Remedies at the Civil Rights Project here, and their director, Dan Lowson, has done amazing work in this area, really analyzing the data. He and his colleagues go for very intensive analyses of the data state by state, district by district, and really have been able to identify a number of things that the data tells us, but they've also identified that the data isn't being properly reported. So I just shared with you one of the data requirements under the special education law that the federal government requires. So school districts should be reporting that data to the federal government. And that data is publicly available. You can go on the website. If you go to the Office of Civil Rights, the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights website, you can look at this data. They've just actually recently published the most current data, and you can look. And what Dan Lawson and his colleagues at the Center for Civil Rights Remedies found was that 49 states failed to meet the disciplinary data, and that should not say date, it should say data, sorry, for kids in special education. That's pretty bad. 49 states, only one state did it right. That's really bad. And I can say that my own personal experience with this is, I have, when I've been looking, my work in Massachusetts, and so a lot of the kids that I work with have been arrested, they've been suspended repeatedly, the whole school to prison pipeline. And I was also interested in the use of physical restraints that we talked about momentarily just a little while ago. And so I looked up one of the school districts that I have been working with kids where they're going to school to see what their data was that they reported through the state to the federal government on the use of restraints. And it said 0. I said, 0? How could that be? I have records that have taken over my whole office. All I have is a little area for me to sit at my desk because I'm surrounded by records, which are half of them are restraint records. So how could it be 0? I know just from anecdotal evidence that I have sitting here in my office, that's not right. And turns out, not surprising, I guess, because if 49 states can't get it right, then why should they have gotten it right? So you're probably saying, well, wait a minute. You just said the data was really important. Now what do we do? Because they're not reporting it. Well, the good news is that even if they didn't meet all the requirements, they did report some things. So there's a number of states are reporting things because they're getting money from the federal government, and they are reporting things. And we also know that things that don't get reported, interestingly, to the federal government somehow get reported in other places that you can find. So one of the things that I like to do when I'm in Massachusetts is I like to go on our Massachusetts, it's called the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education there, but it's basically our Department of Education, and they have all kinds of data, and I'm on there for hours playing with the data, looking at different school districts and comparing, and there's all kinds of things you can do, spreadsheets and disciplinary data. But interestingly, the data that if you go onto the OCR website, doesn't always match up. So what that tells you is that there's something really wrong with the way, I'm not sure what it is with the reporting of the federal data, but you can find data. And we do know this, that if anything, the data that we have, at least it's showing that there's a problem. I don't think it's over-reporting, because there's not an incentive for that. And the anecdotal evidence and the other corresponding data that we can look at shows that, if anything, it's under-reporting. And so, it's just good to know that, but that doesn't mean you can't use the data. You can use the data, you just have to understand the problems with the data. And each school district is different, each school is different, and you just kind of have to look at it. And that's why if you're really interested in this stuff, I would definitely go to the Center for Civil Rights Remedies website, and I'll leave my card if people need help finding things. You can contact me, and I can send you stuff via email or head you in the right direction. But they have amazing things, and so that's just one of their reports. So we do have data, even if it's not perfect, and like I said, it's really important. And I want to give you now a flavor of what this data is telling us, and really show you why, when I am standing here saying there's this really disproportionate effect of these school prison pipeline policies, they're not obviously called that, but the disciplinary policies really do have a shocking disproportionate effect. And I'm going to give you some examples of 3 school districts in just a minute, just by way of example, but I kind of, well, I'll explain why I pulled those. But first, let's give a little sense of what's going on nationally. And this information I was also able to get from, because the folks at the Civil Rights Remedies Center have done such an amazing job. They have this amazing data. And so here's one of the reports that they had from the 2009-2010 school year. And remember that because it takes a while to get data, data's always behind. So it's not like I can have 2015 data for you because we just don't have it right now. But one of the reports, this just gives you an example that you can see. And this is not broken down by disability, not this stuff, but this is just give you an example that nationally, 7.4% of the kids who were in kindergarten through 12th grade were suspended. Now, compare that to the national figure for kids who are African American. 17%. That's huge. That's more than twice the number of kids overall. The number of kids who were white who were suspended, 5%. Kids who are Latino or Hispanic, and the reason I put Hispanic is that's what's in the report, but 7%. So you can see huge disparities, particularly among African Americans. Okay, what about secondary students? Well, the data gets worse because suspensions happen much more when kids get into secondary school, meaning when I say secondary, I'm talking about middle school or junior high, whatever you want to call it here, and high school. These are not including the elementary school kids. So nationally, what we saw in 2009-2010 school year was that 11.3% of secondary students were suspended. 24.3% of all secondary African American students were suspended. 7.1% of all secondary white students, and 12% of all secondary Latino or Hispanic students. So I think the numbers kind of speak for themselves. Does anybody have any questions about this data or these numbers or comments before we move on? Okay. So now, let's talk about the intersection of race, ethnicity, and disability. Because what we were just talking about, we were just looking at overall data that was comparing race, really. Suspension data throughout the United States. What we know from the data is that nationally, kids of color with disabilities, particularly African American children, particularly African American males, are suspended at the highest rates of all children in the United States. And I'm going to give you some examples. The examples that I pulled were Berkeley, the Unified School District, the Berkeley Unified School District in Berkeley, California, the Madison Metropolitan School District in Madison, Wisconsin, and the Seattle Public Schools in Seattle, Washington. And I want to, once again, give credit to the Civil Rights Remedies project, because they came up with this fabulous web tool. And again, if you're interested in data, their web tool is available on the web. You can look up any school or school district and type it in, and you will get this data. And there's a whole bunch of different metrics and using the tool. So I just picked out these 3 school districts. And you might say, well, why did I pick these 3 school districts? Well, here's why. When you think of Berkeley, California, well, I can just say, I think I went to UC Berkeley. I think pretty liberal, right? You know, UC Berkeley. It seemed like that when I went to college. It still seems like that to me. Similarly, Madison, Wisconsin seems like a pretty liberal place, right? It's a liberal university there. And Seattle, I lived in Seattle. It's a liberal place. And so I thought, okay, let's check it out. Let's take a look at places. I'm not talking about Mississippi right now. I'm not talking about Alabama or Idaho, where I would expect things to be more conservative. And I just want to check out what's going on in what I think are liberal towns. And maybe I'm wrong, but I think that these are probably, often considered to be liberal. All right, so we'll start out with Berkeley. Check it out. Berkeley, 36.1% of African American children with disabilities were suspended in 2009 and 2010. 15.5% of African American children without disabilities were suspended. 6.3% of white children with disabilities and 1.8% of white children without disabilities. So what does this tell you? It tells you at least two things, and that is, if you're an African American kid with a disability, you are at much higher likely to be suspended. And I'm just talking about suspensions now. This isn't about arrests. I only wanted to just, because we have a limited amount of time, but I wanted to really bring this home, how bad of a problem is. Berkeley, California, where we all think it's so liberal. Well, maybe it is liberal, but these kids are being kicked out. They're being pushed out. Almost 6 times more than white kids with disabilities. 6 times, almost 6 times. That's the math on that. So what it tells you is, so first of all, it shows that African Americans are being suspended at much higher rates. We saw that. And then you add disability to it, and you know, while this data didn't break down the type of disability, you know, it is often kids who have mental health disabilities that are being pushed out because of the behavioral problems that may stem from their disabilities. But this is really, I think, pretty powerful data that, you know, I was really surprised when I did the little tool and this is what came up for Berkeley. I was really disappointed. So, sorry Berkeley, but it's true. Okay, let's check out what's going on in Madison. Oh God, it's worse. Look at this, Madison, Wisconsin. 39.7% of African American children with disabilities were suspended in 2009 and 10. 15.1% of African American children without disabilities were suspended. So again, it's a similar rate of disability, rate of suspension for kids who are African American, but an even higher rate for kids who are African American with disabilities. White children with disabilities, this was also pretty outrageous, 21.2%, were 5% of white kids without disabilities. So what this tells you in Madison, Wisconsin, regardless of your race, if you have a disability, you better watch out because there's a very high percentage of suspension for those kids. But it's shocking, the number of kids that African American with disabilities being suspended in that school district. Now that was in 2009, 10. Maybe they've had some changes and things are better. I really don't know. I didn't check the data. But this is the data from 2009 from that tool. And it's, you know, all of that stuff comes from the data that they themselves report. So, all right, let's move to Seattle and see what's going on up north. Not so good. 31.6% of African American children with disabilities got suspended. 12% of African American children without disabilities. 9% white children with disabilities, and 2.7% of white children without disabilities. So we picked out now 3 towns, 3 school districts that one might have had some hope that we wouldn't see these numbers, but we do. And that I wanted you to really see this because this, you know, this really demonstrates the problem, and it also shows you that it's all over the place. And yeah, I mean, it's true that we didn't get into the numbers from the South. Sometimes some of the numbers down there are actually a little bit better because there have been legal interventions and for various other kinds of things that have happened. In other places, the numbers aren't better. But one thing is true is that in most places in the United States, if you just go on that tool and you start putting in states, you're going to see data that's similar to this. It will vary, but you'll see similar kinds of data. And it is true that the demographics, so some places have fewer African Americans and fewer Latinos or fewer white kids, but still these are measuring it by the percentage of those kids who are attending the schools. So it is true that the numbers might be different because of that, but it's still a very high percentage. You had a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, like, in the data, does it show what kind of disabilities?
No, it does not. It does not. Not this data. Sometimes you can go, it depends on your state, but sometimes the state might have data that's broken down more about disability. But it's hard to do that because the federal government isn't requiring them to report that. So, unless they want themselves, they've done some sort of performance improvement project or something where they want to measure that data, it's sometimes hard to find that. But just anecdotally, I can say that it's often kids with mental health disabilities and, who end up in this situation, by and large, not exclusively. Okay, so moving right along. Now I want to talk about, focus a little more on kids with disabilities, but, not to exclude anybody from that because it doesn't really matter what race or ethnicity you are, could have a disability or not. One of the things that happens to kids with mental health disabilities is that they are often, in many school districts, when they get pushed out of school, many of them who are in special education, there are restrictions about kicking them out of school and processes that they have to go through, but that doesn't mean they can't be kicked out. They certainly are all the time. And what often happens is that when it is determined that their behavior is such that they are not, cooperating in the classroom, and it is determined by the school district that they're not benefiting from their education, not making progress, they're often sent to these segregated public day schools. And those schools exist around the country in various different school districts. Not every school district has them, but they're really like alternative schools, but they are completely segregated. They are for students who have mental health disabilities. There are, in most of these kinds of schools, little or no opportunity for any integration at all. So no opportunities to be with peers who don't have disabilities. So they're just kind of off. So you thought that segregation was over? Not so much, because these schools exist. And they're just off somewhere. Often the schools aren't very nice. And, there's a lot of stigma around these schools and the kids that go to those schools. A high percentage of the kids who go there are often, particularly in areas where, in urban areas, there's a high percentage of kids of color. These schools often don't provide equal educational opportunities. So not only are they segregated, which is an issue, but they also don't always provide equal educational opportunities, which can result in discrimination based on disability. And so some of the ways in which there are unequal educational opportunities is there's fewer highly qualified teachers, fewer instructional hours. So what that means is that a kid could graduate from high school with actually significantly less educational time because the school was set up so that they graduate faster with less time than you would have gotten if you were a kid going to a regular high school. There's a smaller range of courses, sometimes no opportunity to take honors classes, sometimes no opportunity or very few opportunities for any extracurricular activities or any after-school sports or any sort of opportunities like, when you're in high school, sometimes college recruiters come. Well, a lot of times nobody's coming to these schools to recruit anybody. So those are ways in which the public day schools can be segregated. I think somebody had a question?
Oh, I did
Yes.
actually. I'm just wondering, are you sure that these alternative high schools are specifically only for mentally disabled students?
Well, there are other alternative high schools that are not.
Oh,
So-
okay, so there's like a combination.
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked that because I don't want anyone to be confused. So thank you. So there are alternative high schools all over the place. And people go to them for a variety of reasons. Sometimes because that's what they want to do. Sometimes there's alternative high schools that focus on art and theater, and that's what somebody wants to do. Or there's an alternative school. There might be a kid who, got into trouble and is being disciplined and goes to an alternative school, but that school isn't a segregated school for a kid with disability. What I'm talking about is a public day school that is for kids with disabilities, kids who are in special education, and those schools exist, but that doesn't mean the other kinds don't. And these particular ones are often these segregated schools with no opportunities for integration, like I was talking about, and oftentimes unequal educational opportunities. Now, sometimes these other alternative schools, they too don't necessarily have the best conditions in those schools. So I'm aware of those things. And kids with disabilities can end up in these other kinds of alternative schools too. So it's not that they can't, but these are these special, quote unquote, special kind of schools that are just for kids. So I hope that clarifies. So the other thing to know about public day schools is that they can often end up, depends on the school, but they can often end up being the feeder to the school to prison pipeline. So in some places, you see that there's a disproportionately high rate of suspension, expulsion, school-based arrest, and dropout from these schools. The very schools that are supposedly the quote-unquote therapeutic schools that the school district says, oh, you need to go there, you have a mental health disability, and you need to make some educational progress, so we're going to send you here. But yet, there's all these inequities, and then these are the very feeders. Now, I'm not saying that every single one of them and every single district is like this, but this definitely happens. This is definitely an issue. And I'll give you a very specific example. Springfield, Massachusetts. They have they have one public day school with 3 different campuses. So there is the elementary school campus, the middle school, and the high school. And these schools are exclusively for kids with mental health disabilities who it has been determined by the district that their behaviors are such that they aren't, as I think some people like to say, available for learning, and so they're put in these schools, and they're supposed to be therapeutic schools. The data shows you, and I'm going to share with you 2013, 2014 data that was reported, and I got this data off of the, this is hot off the press because this data I think came out in December of 2014, and it was published by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in Massachusetts, our Department of Education. So I'm not going to go into a long thing about the public day schools, but I will give you this data because this is public data. 54 at the public day middle school, this is just a little sampling, but at the public day middle school, and remember this is all kids with mental health disabilities, 54.1% of the kids were subjected to out-of-school suspension, compared to a district-wide suspension rate of 9.5%. And this is for what we call all offenses, so it could be, any violation of any rules, serious to non-serious. I didn't break it down. You can get it broken down, but for the purposes of this discussion, I just wanted to give you the broader data. But 54.1% compared to 9.5% district-wide. That's huge. At the public day high school, 26.1% were subjected to out-of-school suspensions compared to the 9.5% district-wide rate. So again, the numbers tell a really important story here, that these kids are being suspended at much higher rates. This isn't the numbers aren't the only part of the story, so I don't want to mislead you and have you think like, oh, well, if I just have data, like that's enough. You need more, but this is a very important key piece of what you need to know when you're going to do advocacy in this area. Yes?
I had a question about the suspension. Was it the same in the respect that if you did a certain behavior, you would get X amount of days suspended in a non-public day high school versus a one for people with mental health disabilities?
Well, presumably. I mean, I don't. This is for what they call all offenses, and the schools in Massachusetts have a code of conduct. Each school district has to have a code of conduct under state law. So that code of conduct is really, dictates what is an offense. I mean, I can't believe that I'm talking like that, but offense in the context of education, you'd think I was talking about like some sort of juvenile detention center. But that's what they call it. That's what the state refers to the data. So those codes of conduct should be evenly applied across the district. So it's not like you have one code of conduct for one school and another for another. It's the same code of conduct. So presumably it's the same, but how it's being implemented, the question of implementation is important. So there's a lot of discretion, in all things. So how even if there's not supposed to be, there could be. And so how is it being implemented? But the fact is it's the same code of conduct. Yes? Oh, did you? Oh, okay.
Sorry.
So I wanted to, so now on to like the happier news, because I know we've been talking about a lot of really unhappy things, really sad things. Kids with disabilities, kids of color getting kicked out of school and into the juvenile justice and criminal justice system. And that's terrible. That's terrible. That is not the place those kids need to be. They need to be in school, they need to graduate, and they need to be going to college, because there's no reason why they can't, and they should. So let's talk about how we're going to fix it, because I'm all about let's resolve it. And that's what I spend my life trying to do. I don't know how successfully, but I'm trying. So first, I was talking to you earlier about different ways that you can bring about change, and I'm excited because you're all students and you all have, hopefully, you can do whatever you want, and it's always, I always think back to like when I was your age and thinking about like how you could just write your own ticket. You can decide. It's like being like a kid in a candy store saying, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. So you can do whatever you want. If you decide to go down this path, cool, call me, I'll help you out. But you can do legislative work and policy reform work to bring about this change. And so some really cool stuff is going on. Some of the stuff that my colleagues around the state in Massachusetts and I are working on in Massachusetts are, right now we're working on some proposed legislation to reduce school-based arrests for disturbing school assembly. So remember I was telling you about the kids that run and scream in the hallway and they get arrested? Well, we think that should stop. That's just, that's nonsense. And so we have proposed, in fact, last year we proposed legislation. It made it pretty far. It got killed at the end, but we're trying again. And what we're really trying to do is, instead of having kids get arrested for these kinds of behaviors, we want for positive behavioral support assessments, behavioral assessments, and positive behavioral support interventions to be given to the kids so they can learn alternative coping skills or learn other skills that are positive skills to help control their behavior and not get arrested. And not take a punitive approach, but really a positive approach, which is evidence-based. It's something that has demonstrated by the professionals in the field to work, and we think that it can work. And so we're trying again. The legislative process in Massachusetts is a long one and complicated, I guess maybe because it's such an older state, Commonwealth, because it's not, they like to say Commonwealth. I'm originally, from out west, and so when I say state, they always kind of give me a look. But another thing that did pass and that we're in the process of implementing now, and I'm on a coalition to implement, is something called Chapter 222, and it is a, it's a piece of legislation that requires that for all kids, not just kids with disabilities, but all kids who are being threatened with suspension or expulsion, with some exceptions, like if they've been alleged to have committed a felony or something that's like a dangerous. The legislation, the Chapter 222 legislation, it was passed in 2012. It just came into effect in July of 2014. And so it requires two key pieces of it. I mean, three key pieces. One is that it requires that kids who are being threatened with expulsion, like I said, or suspension, that they be given procedural due process protections before they are suspended. There can be an emergency removal, but they still have a right to due process. And there's several levels of due process. And you can present evidence, you can bring an attorney. So it's a pretty serious thing. And all of you have to have proper notice. And so that's really important, because what was happening a lot is that kids were being suspended, and like I said, the parents would just have to come and get their kids. There was sometimes no notice, or if the parents weren't called, that they were just sending the kids home, and who knows if they made it home, and in what condition. And so, this now adds some due process to it and puts the burden on the school district to demonstrate that the kids should actually be suspended. And there can't be then now these sort of, rules that, like, for example, well, if you get arrested, you're automatically suspended. It doesn't work like that way. One size does not fit all. There has to be this process. For those kids who do get suspended under this law, the other piece that's really important, and again, this applies to all kids, not just kids with disabilities, and it doesn't take away from the rights that kids with disabilities have under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act or under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it's just more protection. They have a right to alternative education, but importantly, they have a right to alternative education that gives them an opportunity to make progress, and that's really important. Because if it's just you have a right to have alternative education, guess what? Here is a little worksheet, have a good time, see you in an hour, and then you're done. It has to be something meaningful. And what that looks like, we'll sort of see. It's a new law, and, I'm sure there'll be challenges to what was meaningful and what wasn't. These things always happen when new laws come about. But this is really important because it really does, make sure that kids, even if they are going to get suspended, they're going to get education. They're not going to just sit there with nothing. The other thing that it does is it requires reporting requirements. In addition to the data that we've talked about at the federal level and any other state reporting data that Massachusetts has for school districts, they also have to report data on suspensions. How many suspensions? They're going to have to really give all this information, and the state in turn has to monitor. And where the state sees unusual levels of suspensions or things that seem problematic in reviewing this data, then the state's going to have to come in and work with the district, give them a plan of correction, and help them fix the problem. So this is all very new, and it's cutting edge, and we'll see how it goes. What as part of my role on the coalition, is helped draft proposed regulations that we submitted. I was actually working on the committee that worked on the data regulations, on the reporting and stuff, that we proposed to the state. And the good news is the regulations, after a long time, they turned out pretty well. They didn't adopt everything we asked for, but they adopted a lot. And that's a way that you can be involved in policy change, by the way, is commenting on regulations and getting coalitions together and signing on. That's what we did. And getting, groups who have common interests. So that's a way to do that. Or to propose legislation. We have coalitions doing that. Other examples, here in California, in Los Angeles, they have really decided, and I'm really happy about this, they've decided that they really have to decriminalize schoolhouse behavior. They get it. They understand that this is not going to be good for anybody. So they are starting to work on ways to instead provide other supports, mental health supports, behavioral supports, other kinds of things, restorative justice, other kinds of interventions in lieu of criminalizing kids for these behaviors. And so it's really good news. It's new. We'll see how it goes, but I think it's definitely a positive. In Connecticut, another example is that in Hartford, Connecticut, there have been efforts to, for advocates to enter into memos of understanding with Hartford School District and their police to think about alternative ways to work with the kids instead of criminalizing. The police are still involved in the schools, but but they're shifting their thinking and working collaboratively with advocates. So that also is another, really positive thing. So with all the grim news, there are positive things happening. And legislative and policy initiatives are a really good way to go with these kinds of things, because litigating cases is hard, it's expensive, and there are lots of it's just full of litigation. Is just hard. I'll just put it that way. And not to say that legislative and policy initiatives aren't, because they certainly are not easy. But sometimes they're less expensive, and sometimes you can get things done more quickly. And sometimes that's, there is no legal remedy for what you're trying to do necessarily in some cases. And so a legislative or policy remedy is what you really need. That does not mean, however, that you don't have other remedies like legal remedies. And legal remedies are very important where a legal remedy can be had. But before we get to that, I want to also point out that you can have administrative remedies, which are like legal remedies, but they're through an administrative process. And in the education world, if you are an individual, or even if you're a group of individuals, you often are required by law to exhaust your administrative remedies before you can go to court anyway. So you have to seek these administrative remedies, and sometimes they can, seem like they take a long time, seem really annoying that you have to do it, but sometimes you can really get some systemic changes done at that administrative level and not have to go to court. Some of the things that you can do to bring about systemic changes about some of these issues that we've talked about today is file an OCR complaint. That's a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. That's the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights. They take complaints. If anyone's interested on how to do that, you can let me know, and I can send you the link. And there's no guarantee that what the outcome will be, but it is a way to do that. You can file a complaint on behalf of a group of people or an individual. You can also file complaints with the United States Department of Justice. So that's another option. You can also, states, especially in the context, often have a complaint process, and certainly for special education they do. So the state of California, you can file a compliance complaint with the State Department of Education against a school district. You can do it on behalf of an individual or a group of individuals. That's a way you can do it. You can also, for an individual, not a group of individuals, although you can try, like I've certainly tried, you can file a request for administrative hearing. And the thing you should know is that in most situations, that if you want to go to court, even if you want to bring like a lawsuit that's not a special education lawsuit, but it's pertaining to education of a kid, like, for example, you want to bring a lawsuit under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you still have to exhaust your administrative remedies. And you have to go through that process. Because if you try to go right to federal court or right to state court, you're probably going to get dismissed, unless it's unusual circumstances, very narrow set of circumstances, which I won't get into now. But mostly you have to exhaust your administrative remedies. If somebody wants to file, ask for an administrative hearing, but they've already filed an OCR complaint or a state complaint, then what will happen is those state complaints or the OCR complaint go on hold while the administrative hearing proceeds. So you kind of end up having to pick. I mean, eventually your other proceedings can go forward, but sometimes they're mooted out by what happens at the administrative hearing. So it's just a strategy thing to think about. You can also do litigation. Right now, I am involved with the lawsuit against the City of Springfield in a case called SS versus the City of Springfield. That is a Title II ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act case that challenges the school district's segregation of kids with mental health disabilities at the public day schools that I was talking about, and their failure to provide equal educational opportunities to those children. So that case was filed in June, and so we're still in litigation land. Cases last a long time, so we're still at the beginning of that. And we hope that a class will be certified in that case, but that's at the very beginning of it. It is not a special education case. It is a discrimination case brought under the ADA only. There are only ADA claims. There is also a case in New York City. The ACLU has brought litigation, and the ACLU is very, very active in the school to prison pipeline stuff. They have done some amazing work. And if you're interested in reading their stuff, if you just type in ACLU and school to prison pipeline, all kinds of stuff will come up. They have really amazing reports from many different states talking about all of the issues that we've been talking about today. So I really, I would encourage you to read some of the reports they've written. They're really very good. There's been there's a number of other agencies, educational advocates, civil rights groups that are doing this work, and so this isn't something that people don't know about. This is a really important issue, and there's lots of ways to get involved if you're interested. So that, believe it or not, will bring me to the conclusion. So thank you all for sitting here for the hour and a half while I was yapping. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Or
How about a little applause first?
yes.
If we're interested in supporting new initiatives that are coming out, where should we look? Like, what's a good resource to?
So if you, one of the things you can do is, for example, if you go, a lot of times different education advocates will have like their legislative agendas on their websites. And so some good places to check are, for example, Disability Rights California. I used to work for them. They have a very robust, they do legal advocacy, but they have very robust legislative policy agenda every year, and they're very involved in these kinds of issues, so you might want to check them out. The Disability Rights Legal Center also does a lot of legislative work, so you may also want to check them out. Public Counsel, they are very, very involved also. I don't want to leave, the good news for you guys are, you're in LA, so you've got, lots of different places, different ways, but those are just some of the many different places that you could check out, and you could even, if you just look on their website, you can see their legislative initiatives, and also, if you want, I can think about it some more. I'll leave some cards and you can take them. You can always feel free to email me. I work for the Center for Public Representation. We provide a lot of, technical backup to particularly disability rights attorneys throughout the United States and stuff. So, I have a lot of information on these kinds of issues. So you can call. So any other questions? The three places that I just told you, they're all here in Los Angeles. So it's a good start. And also, you may also want to talk to the people here at the Center for Civil Rights Remedies here at UCLA. I mean, they're right here on your campus. Okay, well, thanks you all, and go have some snacks.